The morning of June 10, 1944, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter stood on the cliffs above Arromanches, binoculars pressed against his eyes, watching something that should not exist. Below him, stretching into the English Channel for nearly 8 kilometers, massive concrete structures rose from the water like the bones of some prehistoric creature. British ships were unloading cargo at floating piers that moved up and down with the tide. Trucks drove along roadways that floated on the surface of the ocean. It had been 4 days since the Allied invasion. 4 days after, Richter's 716th Infantry Division had been shattered defending these beaches. He had expected the Allies to attempt capturing Cherbourg, the nearest major port, 50 kilometers to the west. Every German defensive plan had assumed this. Instead, the British were building a port here, on an open beach, in less than a week. Richter lowered his binoculars and turned to his operations officer, Major Klaus Hoffmann. "How long did it take us to build the harbor facilities at Cherbourg?" he asked quietly. Hoffmann consulted his notes. "The original port took 7 years to construct, Herr General. Our recent fortifications added another 18 months. Richter looked back at the impossible harbor taking shape below. "They've done this in 4 days, he said. Then, almost to himself, he added the words that would appear in his diary that evening. "The war is over. We just don't know it yet." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This moment of recognition, repeated in various forms across dozens of German officers during those June days in Normandy, represented something more profound than tactical defeat. It marked the collision between German military doctrine, which emphasized quality, craftsmanship, and battlefield excellence, and American industrial philosophy, which valued speed, scale, and logistical sustainability. The Mulberry Harbors were not just engineering marvels. They were visible proof that Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare. To understand why the sight of floating harbors shattered German confidence, we must first understand what German officers believed about the invasion, about ports, and about American capabilities. These beliefs had been carefully constructed over years of military planning, intelligence analysis, and, most critically, ideological assumptions about industrial warfare. September 12, 1943. Wehrmacht High Command Conference Room, Berlin. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in Western Europe, presented his defensive strategy to senior staff officers. A large map of the French coast dominated one wall, marked with red pins indicating fortified positions. Von Rundstedt's pointer traced along the coastline. "The Allies face an insurmountable problem," he explained. "They cannot invade without capturing a major port. They cannot capture a major port without suffering catastrophic casualties. We have fortified every significant harbor from Norway to Spain." The logic was impeccable by traditional military standards. Modern armies required massive quantities of supplies. Infantry divisions consumed approximately 40 metric tons of material daily. Armored divisions needed 3 times that amount. An invasion force of sufficient size to threaten German positions would require landing thousands of tons of supplies every single day. This could only be accomplished through established port facilities with cranes, docks, warehouses, and transportation infrastructure. Admiral Theodor Kranke, commander of German naval forces in the West, reinforced this analysis. "Our intelligence indicates the Allies are assembling landing craft capable of delivering troops directly onto beaches," he noted. "But landing craft cannot sustain an army. They can deliver perhaps 200 tons per day per beach. An invasion force requires 10,000 tons daily at minimum. They must capture a port within 72 hours, or their attack will collapse from lack of supplies." This assessment was not mere speculation. It was supported by historical precedent, by detailed logistical calculations, and most significantly, by the disastrous Allied raid on Dieppe in August 1942. The Dieppe operation had been specifically designed to test whether the Allies could capture a defended port. Over 6,000 troops, predominantly Canadian, had assaulted the harbor. Within 9 hours, more than 3,600 were killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans had repulsed the attack without even deploying major reinforcements. The lesson seemed clear. Fortified ports were impregnable. General d'Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps responsible for defending Normandy, built his entire defensive strategy around this assumption. His detailed analysis, submitted in October 1943, identified the most likely invasion beaches and then systematically dismissed them. 2000. The Allies cannot sustain operations at Caen without capturing the port facilities, he wrote. The nearest significant port is Cherbourg, 50 kilometers from the proposed landing zones. They cannot supply an army across open beaches for the weeks required to capture Cherbourg. Therefore, they will attempt a direct assault on Cherbourg itself, or they will land at Calais where port facilities are closer. This analysis contained a fatal flaw, but it was a flaw that wouldn't become apparent until June 6, 1944. German planners assumed that logistics were constrained by existing infrastructure. They could not conceive that the Allies might bring their own infrastructure with them. The German blind spot wasn't due to lack of intelligence. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, German reconnaissance had detected unusual construction activity in British ports. Aerial photographs showed large concrete structures being built in dry docks along the Thames and Clyde rivers. Intelligence reports noted the construction of unusual steel pontoons and bridge sections. German analysts examined these photos carefully. Their conclusion, filed in March 1944, seemed reasonable. The concrete structures appear to be components for post-war reconstruction, possibly floating fuel storage tanks or temporary bridge supports. No evidence suggests the British are attempting anything beyond conventional port facilities. This interpretation was reinforced by German assumptions about engineering capabilities. Oberst Friedrich Hossbach, chief engineer for Army Group B, submitted a technical assessment in April 1944. To create a functional harbor requires stable breakwaters extending to depths of at least 10 meters, he wrote. Such structures cannot be transported and must be constructed on site. The construction time for adequate harbor facilities is measured in months, not days. The Allies may attempt temporary pier structures using their landing craft, but these will be vulnerable to weather and German artillery fire. They cannot provide sustainable logistics. What Hossbach didn't know was that British engineers had already solved every problem he considered insurmountable. At that very moment, 213 massive concrete caissons were nearing completion in British shipyards. Each of the largest caissons measured 61 meters long, 18 meters wide, and 18 meters tall, displacing over 6,000 tons. These Phoenix caissons could float when their internal chambers were filled with air, then sink in precise positions when water flooded those chambers. When arranged in careful arcs, they would form breakwaters 8 kilometers long, creating protected harbors in open water. Behind the Phoenix breakwaters would come the spud pier heads, floating platforms mounted on massive legs that extended to the seabed. These pier heads could rise and fall with Normandy's 7-meter tides, maintaining stable platforms for ships to unload regardless of tidal conditions. Connecting the pier heads to shore would be the whale roadways, floating bridge spans supported by steel and concrete pontoons, creating highways on the water. The entire system represented something unprecedented in military history: portable, prefabricated infrastructure on a scale that defied conventional engineering assumptions. But more than that, it represented a fundamentally different approach to military logistics. The Germans planned to fight with what they had, conserving resources and defending fixed positions. The Americans and British planned to bring everything they needed, overwhelming any defense through sheer scale of supply. December 15, 1943. SS Panzer Division Headquarters, Nancy, France. SS Brigadeführer Fritz Witt addressed his battalion commanders about the coming invasion. Witt was a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. His division was among the Wehrmacht's elite units, equipped with new Panther tanks and thoroughly trained. When the Allies come, Witt told his officers, their first objective will be capturing a port. They will land at Calais or attempt Cherbourg directly. Our mobile reserves will counterattack before they can establish supply lines. Without port facilities, their invasion force will wither within a week. Major Hubert Meyer, the division's operations officer, had reviewed intelligence reports about Allied preparations. The reconnaissance shows extensive landing craft construction, he noted. They may attempt beach landings at multiple points. Witt dismissed this concern. Landing craft can deliver troops, he said, but modern mechanized warfare requires fuel, ammunition, spare parts, heavy equipment. You cannot sustain armored divisions through small boats running onto beaches. They need cranes to unload tanks, warehouses to store ammunition, fuel depots to supply vehicles. All of this requires established ports. We have ensured they cannot capture ports without unacceptable losses. This confidence wasn't mere optimism. It was based on detailed understanding of logistical requirements. A single American armored division required 400 tons of supplies daily during active operations. An infantry division needed 300 tons. The Allied invasion force would need to include at least 8 divisions to have any hope of breaking through German defenses. This meant supplying over 3,000 tons per day, minimum, with requirements rapidly increasing as more divisions landed. The mathematics were inescapable. Landing craft of the type the Allies were building could carry perhaps 20 tons of cargo each. Even with constant operations, they could deliver only a few hundred tons per day per beach. To supply an invasion force adequately would require capturing port facilities capable of handling thousands of tons daily. The Germans had spent 3 years ensuring that capturing such ports would be impossible. What German planners failed to consider was that their entire analytical framework might be obsolete. They were fighting the last war, assuming that logistical constraints of 1918 or even 1940 still applied. They did not grasp that American industrial capacity had fundamentally changed the equation. February 28, 1944. Advanced Planning Meeting, Army Group B Headquarters, La Roche-Guyon. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recently appointed to command Army Group B, reviewed defensive preparations with his staff. Rommel had fought the Allies in North Africa and understood their capabilities better than most German officers. But even Rommel's assessment contained critical blind spots. The Allies have advantages in air power and naval gunfire, Rommel acknowledged, but they face fundamental limitations in logistics. I saw this in Africa. American units are dependent on massive supply chains. When those chains are disrupted, their operations collapse. In France, we can disrupt their logistics by denying them ports. If we can hold our coastal positions for even 2 weeks, their invasion will fail from lack of supplies. Rommel's chief of staff, General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, raised a concern. Intelligence suggests the British are constructing unusual structures that might be intended for harbor facilities. Rommel studied the reconnaissance photographs. The images showed large concrete boxes, floating pontoons, and steel bridge sections. These appear to be components for temporary piers, Rommel concluded. The British may attempt to extend their landing beaches with makeshift structures. But nothing in these photographs suggests they can create a functional port capable of handling the tonnage modern warfare requires. We should certainly target these structures with artillery when they appear, but they do not change our fundamental defensive strategy. This analysis, like so many others, was technically accurate but strategically wrong. Yes, the Mulberry Harbors would be vulnerable to artillery fire. Yes, they were less efficient than established ports. But Rommel failed to consider that the Allies didn't need perfect logistics. They needed adequate logistics, sustained over time, supported by overwhelming industrial production. The Mulberry Harbors would provide exactly that. April 9, 1944. Afternoon tea at the headquarters of the 716th Infantry Division, Cayenne. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter, whose division defended the beaches that would become Gold and Juno sectors, discussed invasion scenarios with his regimental commanders. Richter was not a Nazi ideologue, but a professional soldier who had commanded troops since 1917. His assessment was sober and realistic, shaped by 3 decades of military experience. The Allies will come, Richter told his subordinates. Probably this summer. They have assembled forces in England that cannot be hidden, but they face the port problem. Every military operation requires a functioning logistics system. Landing troops is the easy part. Sustaining them is where invasions succeed or fail. He pulled out a map of Normandy. The nearest significant port to our sector is Cherbourg. It would take the Allies at least 3 weeks to fight their way there, probably longer. During those 3 weeks, they must supply their forces across open beaches. This is impossible at the scale they require. Oberst Franz Korfis, commander of the 726th Infantry Regiment, asked, "What if they bring prefabricated port facilities?" Richter considered this. Temporary structures might allow them to land additional troops and light equipment, he conceded. But modern armor requires heavy cranes. Artillery needs ammunition ships with specialized unloading equipment. They cannot improvise a real port on an open beach. The engineering challenges alone would take months. This was the core of German confidence. Not that the Allies lacked courage or capability, but that they faced insurmountable engineering and logistical obstacles. German officers, trained in meticulous planning and careful resource management, could not imagine the Allies might simply overwhelm these obstacles through industrial scale and audacious engineering. May 20th, 1944. Final invasion preparations were underway in England. More than 45,000 workers at 300 sites across Britain were completing the components of the Mulberry Harbors. The scale of the operation was staggering. Over 1 million cubic meters of concrete had been poured into the Phoenix caissons, 70,000 tons of steel. Reinforcement had been fabricated. 9,000 standards of timber had been shaped into formwork. The project had required more materials than some entire military campaigns. Yet German intelligence, despite observing much of this construction, never grasped its purpose or scale. They saw trees, but missed the forest. Individual components seemed innocuous or were misinterpreted. The vast coordination required to synchronize production across hundreds of sites went undetected. The Germans remained confident that their defensive strategy was sound. This confidence would last exactly 4 days after the invasion began. Then, German officers standing on the Norman cliffs would see something that shattered their understanding of modern warfare. They would see a port that shouldn't exist. They would see American industrial might made visible. And many would reach the same conclusion as General Lieutenant Richter. The war was already lost. June 6, 1944, 0200 hours. The English Channel. Convoy EBC-1, the first group of Mulberry Harbor components, departed British ports under cover of darkness. 132 tugboats strained against their tow lines, pulling the massive concrete Phoenix caissons at a painfully slow 8 kilometers per hour. The caissons rode low in the water, their internal chambers filled with just enough air to maintain buoyancy. Each tug crew knew their cargo was essential to the invasion, though many still didn't understand exactly what they were towing. Lieutenant Commander James Arnold, commanding the tug HMS Engage, later described the scene. We could see the invasion fleet ahead of us, thousands of ships stretching to the horizon. Behind us came these enormous concrete boxes, each the size of a small apartment building. We knew they were meant to help supply the invasion, but the full picture didn't become clear until we reached Normandy. At 0630 hours, as the first Allied troops hit the beaches, the Mulberry convoy was still 12 hours from the French coast. The timing was deliberate. The beach assault had to succeed before the harbor components could be positioned. If the Germans repulsed the invasion, the Mulberry components would be worthless, stranded in mid-channel. By 1800 hours on June 6th, Allied forces had secured precarious footholds on 5 beaches. The landings at Omaha had nearly failed, with American troops pinned against the seawall for hours. But by evening, all 5 beaches were held, and the critical work could begin. June 7th, 0800 hours, off Arromanches. The first block ships approached Gold Beach. These were obsolete merchant vessels and warships, deliberately sacrificed to create initial breakwaters. HMS Centurion, a battleship dating from 1911, sailed to her final position. Her crew, reduced to a skeleton complement, opened the seacocks at precisely 0915. Within 20 minutes, Centurion settled onto the seabed, her superstructure still protruding above water. Over the next 48 hours, 70 more block ships would be scuttled in careful arcs off both Omaha and Arromanches, creating the Gooseberry breakwaters. From his position 3 kilometers inland, Oberst Corfez of the 726th Regiment observed the block ships through artillery spotting scopes. His report to division headquarters noted enemy vessels deliberately sunk in apparent pattern, possibly to create obstacles or sheltered anchorage for landing craft. The report was accurate, but didn't grasp the scale of what was coming. June 8th, 0600 hours. The first Phoenix caisson approached Arromanches. Lieutenant Alan Beckett of the Royal Engineers, who had designed much of the Mulberry system, supervised the positioning from a small motor launch. The massive caisson, designated Phoenix A1, was maneuvered into precise position using bearings taken from landmarks on shore. When the positioning was perfect, Beckett gave the order. Engineers opened valves in sequence, flooding specific chambers. The caisson settled majestically into the water, its base coming to rest on the seabed 23 feet below. It was extraordinary, Beckett later recalled. This structure, weighing over 6,000 tons, simply sank into place exactly where we needed it. We had tested the concept on models, but seeing it work at full scale was different. Everything depended on those caissons forming a solid breakwater. Over the following week, the Phoenix laying operation continued around the clock. Each caisson had to be positioned with precision, forming an arc that would create calm water inside while withstanding the full force of Atlantic waves outside. By June 15th, 115 Phoenix caissons had been sunk, creating a breakwater 8 kilometers long. German observation posts tracked this activity with growing confusion. Major Klaus Hoffmann, operations officer of the 716th Division, compiled reports from various units. Enemy constructing large concrete structures in water off Arromanches. Purpose unclear. Structures appear to form continuous barrier, approximately 7 kilometers in length. Artillery fire has damaged several structures, but does not prevent construction. Enemy dedicates significant resources to this project, suggesting major importance. On June 10th, General Lieutenant Richter personally observed the construction from the cliffs. What he saw defied his understanding of military engineering. The concrete structures were clearly designed to create a breakwater, but breakwaters required years to build, not days. Yet here, in less than a week, the British had created a barrier longer than most natural harbors. More disturbing were the other components arriving. Large floating platforms, which Richter's engineers correctly identified as pier heads, were being positioned inside the breakwater. These platforms, mounted on massive legs, could apparently rise and fall with the tide. British ships were already tying up alongside them. Most incredibly, floating roadways were being extended from the pier heads toward the beach. Trucks were driving along these roadways, carrying supplies from ships directly to shore. Richter ordered his artillery to target the harbor structures. German 105mm guns fired on the Phoenix caissons. Several rounds struck home, chipping concrete and occasionally penetrating chambers. But the caissons were massive enough to absorb this damage. Even heavily damaged caissons remained functional as breakwaters. The floating roadways proved more vulnerable. German shells destroyed several whale spans, but British engineers simply replaced them with new sections towed from England. June 12, 1400 hours, Army Group B Headquarters, La Roche-Guyon. Field Marshal Rommel received the first comprehensive report on the Mulberry Harbors. His intelligence staff had compiled observations from multiple units, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and interrogations of captured British engineers. The report's conclusion was stark. The British have constructed a functional artificial harbour at Arromanches, approximately 2 square miles in area, capable of handling significant cargo tonnage. Similar construction is underway at the American beach. The harbours appear to provide capabilities comparable to small natural ports. Rommel studied the reconnaissance photographs in silence. He had fought the British in North Africa and knew they were capable engineers, but this exceeded anything he had imagined possible. The photographs clearly showed cargo ships unloading at floating piers. Trucks moved along floating roadways. The harbour was functioning. He called in General Lieutenant Alfred Gauss, his chief of staff. "How long did we estimate it would take the Allies to capture Cherbourg?" Rommel asked. "Minimum 3 weeks, Herr Feldmarschall," Gauss replied. "Possibly 6 if we conduct a proper defense." Rommel tapped the photographs. "They don't need Cherbourg now. They've built their own port." He paused, then added, "I saw American logistics in Africa. If they can sustain supply through these harbors, our defensive strategy is obsolete." This was the moment when German High Command began to understand the true nature of their situation. The invasion wasn't just about landing troops on beaches. It was about sustaining an entire army indefinitely, using infrastructure the Allies had brought with them. Every German defensive plan had assumed logistical limitations would constrain Allied operations. Those limitations no longer existed. June 13th, 2300 hours. Officers meeting. 1st SS Panzer Corps. SS Obergruppenführer Josef Dietrich, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Corps, discussed the strategic situation with his division commanders. Dietrich was a crude but effective commander, one of Hitler's earliest supporters. But even he could recognize when battlefield realities contradicted ideological assumptions. The British harbour at Arromanches is operational, Dietrich announced. Intelligence reports it is handling over 2,000 tons of supplies daily, and that number is increasing. The American harbour at Omaha is similarly active. SS Brigadeführer Fritz Witt, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, asked the obvious question. How is this possible? Building a port requires months. Dietrich's chief of staff, Brigadeführer Fritz Kramer, explained what intelligence had learned. They didn't build it in France. They built it in England, in pieces, and towed it across the channel. The concrete structures we've been observing are hollow boxes that float. Once positioned, they flood them to sink them in place. The floating piers use hydraulic systems to adjust for the tide. It's quite ingenious, actually. The room fell silent. These were experienced officers who understood logistics and engineering. They recognized immediately what the Mulberry Harbors meant. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, voiced what everyone was thinking. If they can supply their forces without capturing ports, we cannot cut their logistics. Our entire defensive strategy assumed we could starve them out. Dietrich nodded grimly. We can still defeat them tactically. Our panzers are superior, our defensive positions are strong. But strategically, they can sustain operations indefinitely. This changes everything. June 19th, 0300 hours, the English Channel. A violent storm swept across the water, the worst weather in over 20 years. Winds reached near hurricane strength. Waves over 7 meters high battered the Normandy coast. Inside the Mulberry Harbors, chaos ensued. The bombardon floating breakwaters, positioned outside the main Phoenix caisson line, began to fail. These massive cruciform structures, made of steel and rubberized canvas, had been designed to absorb wave energy, but the storm exceeded their design specifications. Some bombardons broke apart under the pounding. Others parted their anchor chains and drifted into the harbors, becoming battering rams that smashed into the very structures they were supposed to protect. At WWII, the American harbor off Omaha Beach, the damage was catastrophic. The bombardons destroyed several whale roadway sections. Waves lifted Phoenix caissons that hadn't been properly secured, shifting them out of position. 2 block ships literally broke their backs, their welded seams splitting under the strain. Landing craft were thrown onto the beaches or smashed against the pier heads. The storm raged for 3 days. All supply operations ceased. Ships at anchor struggled to maintain position. On the beaches, supplies stacked up with nowhere to go, creating logistical bottlenecks that would take weeks to clear. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When the storm subsided on June 22nd, the damage assessment was sobering. Mulberry A was functionally destroyed. Only 10 out of 35 Phoenix caissons remained in proper position. The whale roadways were extensively damaged. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, made the difficult decision not to attempt reconstruction. The Americans would return to running landing craft directly onto Omaha Beach, though they would strengthen the remaining Gooseberry breakwater to provide some protection. Mulberry B at Arromanches had fared better. The more protected location and the fact that construction was further advanced made the critical difference. Approximately half the bombardons were lost, but the Phoenix caissons had held their positions. The decision was made to repair and significantly strengthen Port Winston, as the British had nicknamed their harbour. Additional Phoenix caissons were towed from England. Some were filled with sand to increase stability, a modification that proved so effective it was implemented for all remaining caissons. Steel plates were welded to the tops of damaged Phoenix units. The bombardon system was abandoned entirely, with future wave protection depending solely on the Phoenix caissons, Gooseberry block ships, and natural protection from the Calvados Reef. German commanders watched the storm damage with satisfaction tempered by realism. Oberst Walter Goth, artillery commander of the 84th Corps, reported to General Marks, "The storm has severely damaged enemy harbor facilities. However, the British are already conducting repairs. Their ability to bring replacement components from England means storm damage is merely a temporary setback." Marks understood the implication. Even nature couldn't stop Allied logistics. If a 3-day hurricane couldn't permanently disable the Mulberry Harbors, German artillery certainly wouldn't. By June 28th, The rebuilt Mulberry B had returned to full operation. The harbor that German officers had watched with disbelief 2 weeks earlier was now handling 7,500 tons of cargo daily, achieving the ambitious design goals that had seemed impossible before the invasion. July 4, 1944. Afternoon briefing, 7th Army Headquarters, Le Mans. Generaloberst Friedrich Dollmann, commanding 7th Army, received updated intelligence on Allied supply operations. The numbers were staggering. In the first 4 weeks since D-Day, the Allies had landed over 600,000 troops, 95,000 vehicles, and 630,000 tons of supplies. Most significantly, they had sustained these landing rates despite losing one of the 2 Mulberry Harbors. Dollmann's Chief of Staff, General Major Max Pemsel, presented a detailed analysis. The British harbour at Arromanches is now handling more cargo daily than many peacetime commercial ports. The Americans, despite losing their artificial harbour, have developed efficient beach landing procedures using the Gooseberry breakwater. Combined, they are landing approximately 20,000 tons per day. This exceeds our most pessimistic pre-invasion estimates. The implications were profound. German defensive planning had assumed that even if the Allies established beachheads, logistical constraints would limit their operational tempo. German counterattacks could exploit these limitations, striking before the Allies could build up overwhelming force. But with 20,000 tons landing daily, the Allies could sustain continuous operations indefinitely. Every day, their material advantage grew larger. Dollmann, a career officer who had commanded troops since the First World War, recognized a hopeless situation when he saw one. We are fighting an enemy who can replace every loss, resupply every unit, and reinforce every position. Our strategy was to bleed them faster than they could resupply. But they are resupplying faster than we can inflict casualties. He paused, then added quietly, "We cannot win a war of attrition against an opponent with infinite supplies." July 17, 1944. Generaloberst Dollmann was found dead, officially from a heart attack, though some accounts suggested suicide. Whether he died from natural causes or by his own hand, the stress of commanding a hopeless defense had clearly taken its toll. August 1, 1944. Port Winston had been operational for 8 weeks, double its designed operational life of 90 days, yet the harbour showed no signs of failing. British engineers had continuously reinforced and improved the structures. Additional Phoenix caissons had been added. The Whale roadways had been strengthened with extra pontoons. What had been designed as temporary infrastructure was proving remarkably durable. Oberleutnant Heinrich Prinz Hussein Wittgenstein, an engineer attached to 7th Army Headquarters, submitted a technical assessment of the Mulberry Harbors. His report was a remarkable piece of analysis, combining respect for Allied engineering with recognition of its strategic implications. The British artificial harbour represents a revolutionary approach to military logistics, Wittgenstein wrote. Rather than adapting their invasion plans to existing infrastructure, they created new infrastructure adapted to their plans. The harbour's modular design allows for continuous repair and improvement. Components damaged by weather or enemy fire can be replaced without disrupting operations. The entire system demonstrates a level of industrial organization and engineering capability that exceeds anything in German military planning. Wittgenstein's conclusion was stark. The existence of this harbour means Allied forces in France are logistically invulnerable. They can sustain operations indefinitely without capturing major ports. Our defensive strategy, which relied on denying them port facilities, has been rendered obsolete. We are now fighting an opponent with secure supply lines, overwhelming material superiority, and the industrial capacity to replace any losses. From a purely logistical perspective, the campaign in France is already lost. This assessment reached Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced Rommel after Rommel was wounded in an air attack on July 17th. Von Kluge filed the report without comment, but its conclusions were inescapable. German officers had believed they could defeat the invasion by controlling ports. The Allies had simply eliminated ports from the equation. August 15, 1944, Paris. As Allied forces advanced across France, German intelligence compiled a comprehensive analysis of Mulberry Harbor operations. The statistics told a story of industrial capability that bordered on the incomprehensible from a German perspective. From June 6 through August 15, Mulberry B had handled over 1.7 million troops, 340,000 vehicles, and 2.7 million tons of supplies. At peak capacity, the harbor was moving cargo equivalent to what the port of Hamburg, Germany's largest commercial harbor, handled in peacetime. And the British had built it in weeks, not decades. The intelligence report noted something even more significant. The Americans, despite losing Mulberry A, had developed such efficient beach landing procedures that they were actually landing more supplies per day than the British were through Port Winston. Using WWII amphibious trucks, LST landing ships that could drive directly onto beaches, and improved cargo handling techniques, American forces were offloading over 10,000 tons daily across Omaha Beach. The conclusion was inescapable. The Mulberry Harbors had proven the concept that modern armies could everspace, operate without traditional port infrastructure. Even the destruction of Mulberry A hadn't significantly hindered American operations. The Allies had demonstrated that with enough engineering creativity and industrial capacity, any beach could become a port. September 1st, 1944. As Allied forces liberated Paris and pushed toward the German border, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter was captured near the Seine River. The officer who had predicted the war was over upon seeing the Mulberry Harbors had survived 3 months of desperate fighting. His division, which had defended the Normandy beaches on D-Day, no longer existed as a fighting force. During his interrogation, Richter was asked when he had realized the invasion would succeed. His answer was immediate. June 10th, when I saw what you were building at Arromanches, I had fought in the First War. I understood logistics. I knew that if you could supply an army across open beaches, you could not be stopped. Everything after that was just delaying the inevitable. The interrogating officer, a British major, asked if Richter thought the German army could have stopped the invasion if the Mulberry Harbors hadn't existed. Richter considered carefully before answering. Perhaps for a time, without the artificial harbors, you would have been forced to capture Cherbourg immediately. We might have held Cherbourg for weeks, maybe months, but ultimately, no. You would have brought more landing craft, developed better beach procedures, or built your harbors more slowly. The fundamental problem was not the harbors themselves. It was what they represented. Industrial capacity we could not match, engineering creativity we had not anticipated, and a strategic vision we had failed to understand. November 19th, 1944. Port Winston was officially decommissioned after operating for 10 months, more than 3 times its designed lifespan. In those 10 months, the harbor had handled 2.5 million troops, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. These numbers represented the margin of victory in the campaign to liberate Western Europe. The final supply convoy departed Arromanches on November 18th. British engineers surveyed the Phoenix caissons one last time. These massive concrete structures, which had seemed so audacious in design, had proven remarkably durable. Several would remain in position for decades, eventually becoming permanent features of the Norman coast. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce White, chief engineer for the Mulberry project, reflected on the achievement in his final report. We were told to build a port that could handle 7,500 tons daily, operate in all weather, and last 90 days. We built a port that handled over twice that tonnage, survived the worst storm in 20 years, and operated for 10 months. More importantly, we proved that engineers need not be constrained by conventional assumptions. When told we couldn't build a port on an open beach, we simply redefined what a port could be. December 1944. Interrogation Center, London. German generals captured during the Normandy campaign were systematically interviewed about their pre-invasion assessments and their reactions to Allied capabilities. The transcripts of these interrogations reveal a consistent pattern: shock at the scale of Allied logistics, respect for the engineering achievement of the Mulberry Harbors, and recognition that German strategic planning had been based on obsolete assumptions. General Lieutenant Dietrich von Choltitz, who had commanded forces in Normandy before being transferred to Paris, was asked about the Mulberry Harbors. "We knew you were building something," he said. "Our reconnaissance photographed construction in British ports, but we assumed these were components for port reconstruction after we had destroyed the French harbors. It never occurred to us you would build complete harbors from scratch and tow them across the channel. The engineering audacity was beyond our imagination. The interrogator pressed. Did seeing the artificial harbors change your assessment of German chances? Von Koltitz was blunt. It confirmed what some of us already suspected. We were fighting an opponent who could simply ignore obstacles we considered absolute. You needed ports, so you built them. When we destroyed your roads, you built new ones. When we cut your supply lines, you created alternate routes. You had the industrial capacity to overwhelm any defense through sheer material superiority. The artificial harbors were merely the most visible symbol of this capacity. General der Panzertruppen Leoger von Schweppenberg, whose Panzer Group West had been tasked with destroying the invasion, offered perhaps the most penetrating analysis. The Mulberry Harbors represented a revolution in military thinking that we failed to anticipate. For centuries, armies had been constrained by existing infrastructure. Campaigns were planned around roads, bridges, ports, railways. The side that controlled infrastructure had a decisive advantage. But your artificial harbors demonstrated that modern industrial powers need not accept these constraints. If infrastructure doesn't exist, you can create it. This fundamentally changes warfare. Von Schweppenberg continued, We built the Atlantic Wall assuming you would need to capture existing ports. You made ports irrelevant. We fortified every harbor from Norway to Spain. You invaded where we had no harbors. This is not merely clever tactics. It is a strategic paradigm shift. Wars will no longer be won by controlling existing infrastructure, but by creating new infrastructure faster than the enemy can destroy it. Germany was not prepared for this type of warfare. January 1945. As Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine, the final statistics on Mulberry Harbor operations were compiled. The numbers told a story of engineering triumph and logistical dominance. Total cargo handled at Mulberry B, 4 million tons. Total vehicles landed, 500,000. Total troops processed, 2.5 million. Peak daily cargo throughput, 7,500 tons. Total operational days, 166. Cost of construction, approximately £40 million sterling, equivalent to roughly £6 billion in modern currency. But the statistics didn't capture the broader impact. The Mulberry Harbors had fundamentally altered the strategic equation in Western Europe. By eliminating the need to capture major ports in the invasion's opening phase, they had given Allied forces operational flexibility that German defenses couldn't counter. Every German defensive plan had assumed predictable Allied objectives. The Mulberry Harbors made Allied objectives unpredictable. March 1945, British War Office, London. A comprehensive post-operation report on the Mulberry Harbors was prepared for future military planning. The report's conclusions would influence military logistics doctrine for decades. The Mulberry artificial harbors demonstrate that modern industrial powers can create infrastructure faster than conventional construction timelines would suggest possible. Prefabricated, modular components allow complex systems to be assembled rapidly in hostile environments. This principle applies beyond harbors to roads, bridges, airfields, and other infrastructure. Future military operations should assume that logistical constraints can be overcome through engineering creativity and industrial capacity, rather than accepting them as absolute limitations. The report noted one particularly significant lesson. The Mulberry Harbors succeeded not because of any single innovation, but through the integration of multiple innovations into a coherent system. The Phoenix caissons solved the breakwater problem. The Spud pier heads solved the tidal problem. The whale roadways solved the ship-to-shore problem. Each component was relatively simple in concept, but required exceptional attention to detail in execution. This demonstrates that complex engineering challenges are best approached through systematic problem decomposition rather than searching for single revolutionary solutions. April 1945. As the war in Europe entered its final weeks, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, reflected on German defensive failures. In conversations recorded by his aide, Speer discussed the Mulberry Harbors with surprising candor. We spent 3 years and used 13 million cubic meters of concrete building the Atlantic Wall, Speer said. We fortified every port. We placed artillery batteries to destroy any invasion fleet. We built obstacles to prevent beach landings. All of this was rendered irrelevant by an idea of simple genius. The invasion force brought their own harbors. A fortnight after the Normandy landings, the British had a fully functional port, operating on a beach that had been empty 2 weeks earlier. All our fortifications, all our concrete, all our planning meant nothing. Speer continued. The Mulberry Harbors revealed the fundamental flaw in German strategic thinking. We assumed that wars are won by controlling what exists. The Allies understood that wars are won by creating what doesn't exist. We fortified ports. They built new ones. We destroyed roads. They built new ones. We cut supply lines. They created new ones. Against an opponent with such industrial capacity and engineering creativity, defensive strategies based on controlling infrastructure are obsolete. May 8, 1945. VE Day. The war in Europe was over. German forces had been crushed between advancing Allied armies from west and east. The Wehrmacht, once considered the finest military force in the world, had been defeated not primarily through superior tactics or braver soldiers, but through overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority. The Mulberry Harbors had played a crucial role in this victory. While other factors were certainly important, air superiority, numerical advantage, and intelligence supremacy, the artificial harbors had solved the fundamental logistical challenge that had constrained every previous amphibious invasion. They had proven that modern engineering could overcome obstacles that military tradition considered insurmountable. Post-war analysis. In the years following the war, military historians and engineers studied the Mulberry Harbor project extensively. Their analyses revealed several key factors that had enabled success. Political will. Winston Churchill's personal involvement ensured the project received highest priority. When engineers said something was impossible, Churchill demanded they find a way to make it possible. Industrial coordination. Over 300 companies collaborated on construction, coordinating delivery of components with precision despite wartime chaos. Engineering creativity. Rather than trying to improve existing harbor technology, engineers fundamentally reimagined what a harbor could be. Scale of resources. Britain devoted enormous industrial capacity to the project, treating it as essential to invasion success rather than a secondary priority. Attention to detail. Every component was carefully designed, tested, and refined. Success depended on thousands of small decisions being made correctly. Perhaps most significantly, the Mulberry Harbors demonstrated the importance of challenging fundamental assumptions. When told that invading without capturing a port was impossible, Allied planners responded by questioning whether ports were actually necessary. This willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, to reimagine entire systems rather than just tweaking existing approaches, was perhaps the most important factor in Allied victory. The legacy. The remains of Port Winston still stand at Arromanches today, over 80 years after they were built. The Phoenix caissons remain where they were sunk in June 1944, covered with marine growth, but still structurally sound. They serve as a permanent memorial to one of history's most audacious engineering achievements. But the legacy extends far beyond the physical remains. The Mulberry Harbors influenced military and civilian engineering in ways that continue to resonate. Modern military logistics doctrine assumes that infrastructure can be created rapidly in hostile environments rather than accepting existing infrastructure as a constraint. Modular construction techniques for rapid deployment of infrastructure in disaster areas owe conceptual debts to the Mulberry system. Military pontoon bridges, offshore oil platforms, and temporary housing after natural disasters all reflect lessons learned from the Mulberry Harbors. The principle that seemingly impossible problems can be solved by refusing to accept that they are impossible has become embedded in engineering education. When every conventional approach leads to failure, the solution is not to give up but to question the assumptions underlying conventional approaches. For German officers who witnessed the Mulberry Harbors in June 1944, the psychological impact was profound and immediate. They had built their entire defensive strategy on assumptions about Allied logistical limitations. The artificial harbors shattered those assumptions in a matter of days. The war didn't end in June 1944, but for many German officers, that was when they knew it would end in defeat. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter, standing on the Norman cliffs on June 10th, watching trucks drive along floating roadways toward floating piers where ships unloaded at floating docks, had understood immediately. The Allies hadn't just solved a logistical problem. They had demonstrated a level of industrial capability and engineering audacity that Germany could not match. They had shown that American industrial might, which German propaganda had dismissed as exaggeration, was actually understated. The war was over. Germany just didn't know it yet. But it would learn, day by day, as millions of tons of supplies flowed across those floating harbors, as Allied armies advanced with never-ending stocks of ammunition and fuel. As every destroyed tank was replaced and every casualty reinforced, the Mulberry Harbors hadn't won the war in a single dramatic moment. They had guaranteed that the war would be won, steadily and inexorably, through the mathematics of industrial logistics. In the end, the story of the Mulberry Harbors is not just about engineering achievement, though that achievement was remarkable. It is about strategic vision, the understanding that victory comes not from fighting the enemy's war, but from changing the nature of war itself. The Germans had prepared to fight a war of attrition, believing their superior tactics and technology would overcome Allied numerical advantages. The Allies understood that in modern industrial warfare, the side with secure supply lines and overwhelming material superiority would ultimately prevail. The Phoenix caissons, Spud pierheads, and whale roadways were not merely engineering solutions. They were strategic weapons that neutralized Germany's carefully prepared defenses. They were proof that when political will, engineering creativity, industrial capacity, and human determination all align toward a common goal, achievements that seem impossible become inevitable. The German officers who watched the Mulberry Harbors take shape understood this. They had been trained to believe that quality defeats quantity, that tactical excellence compensates for material disadvantage, that warrior spirit overcomes industrial might. The artificial harbors proved all these beliefs were obsolete. Modern war had become industrial, and the side with the greatest industrial capacity, the most efficient logistics, and the willingness to think beyond conventional constraints would win. General Lieutenant Richter had been right. The war was over. The Mulberry Harbors had made it so, not through direct destruction of German forces, but through the creation of an unbreakable Allied supply chain. Everything that followed, the breakout from Normandy, the liberation of France, the crossing of the Rhine, the final assault on Germany, all of it was made possible by those floating harbors that shouldn't have existed but did. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.